All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to our third installment of our speaker series on affordable housing, the Central Virginia Regional Housing Partnerships Fall and Winter Speaker Series. Today, we are going to be tackling the very interesting issue of missing middle housing, how it affects our region, how it is important nationally and across the state. So before we get started, I would like to briefly introduce our sponsor, the University of Virginia Community Credit Union. And today we have Joseph Rachel here, who's the Chief Lending Officer of the UVA CCU. He's going to say a few words before we get started. And Joseph, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Ian, appreciate it. So UVA Community Credit Union, we are proud to support individuals and families on their journey towards home ownership. And so we do that by offering a wide variety of products through Member Options, which is our wholly owned mortgage subsidiary. And we're very excited this spring we'll be adding several new products to our offerings. But we know that it takes more than financing to prepare someone to be a homeowner. So we also do free financial education, covering topics like budgeting, credit, and home buying, and make sure that home buyers are prepared for the whole thing of being homeowners. We are also proud to work to help eligible veterans, educators, and first responders on first-time home buyers by providing down payment, closing costs, and principal reduction assistance through the Helping Hand ownership program. So finding solutions to affordable housing is important in improving both quality of life of families and the overall economic vitality of our community. And as such, we are proud to sponsor today's event and look forward to this discussion. So thanks again, Ian, and good afternoon to everybody.
Great, thank you, Joe. We can go ahead and get started today. So I'd like to briefly introduce our moderator and panel. Our moderator today is using his funny picture, Keith Smith, who is the chair of the Regional Housing Partnership, which is the organization putting on this event. Today, we also have Emily Hamilton, who's a senior research fellow and director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And joining us briefly, running into a little bit of technical difficulties, we have Suzanne Muma, who's the Associate Director of Urban and Environmental Planning, Director of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Virginia School of Architecture, and also the Director of the UVA Press. So with that, I will hand it over to Keith. As we wait for Suzanne to get on, he will start our questions directed first to Emily.
So I just want to start off. We didn't discuss this in our pre-meeting that you were going to use that goofy picture of mine. So offline, Ian, you and I need to have a conversation about this. But hey, thank you for everybody for joining us. These things are, we love doing them. I personally love moderating them. And this particular topic of missing middle is a little bit near and dear to my heart. And as Ian has jumped off on, we have two rock stars in the house that are going to talk about this. I guess we're waiting on our Suzanne to join us. So at the moment, we get all of Emily's time, which is even better. So just a little housekeeping, guys. We're going to ask a couple of questions, moderated questions with our guests. Please, in the chat, drop in some questions or comments. We're going to try to do the moderated conversations within the first 20-30 minutes, and then try to save a chunk of the time for some Q&A with our panelists. So Emily, I'm going to start off with a pretty high level, big question. How would you define missing middle, right? How is this defined? That's a big question, but how would you do it?
That's a great question, Keith. Thanks so much. Thank you, Ian, and everyone who's joining us this afternoon. It's a great question because I think the term means different things to different people. I think it originated with Dan Paralek, who's written a lot about missing middle housing, and I think coined the term. His focus is on small units and making them feasible to build in neighborhoods where only large single-family houses currently exist. And that can certainly be a great way to increase flexibility in our existing neighborhoods and create opportunities for lower cost housing, small lower cost units where only large, high cost units are currently available. But personally, I like a more expansive definition or concept that allows for some change in neighborhoods, not only in the number of units that they can accommodate within existing structures, but also a little bit of growth in the square footage of housing that's available. In some of the cases where we see lots of small infill construction happening, there is that increased flexibility where, for example, large duplex units or townhouses can be built in places where exclusively detached single-family houses would have been permitted previously.
So generally, when I explain it or we'll talk about it, and you're an expert, so maybe you can pick up on this and either prove me wrong or expand upon it. Missing middle, that technically, from my perspective, has two different paths. It's a structural path, right? It's a path of, okay, we have single family detached on one side of the spectrum, and then we have multifamily on the other, and then there in the middle, there's a structural difference, townhomes, quads, multiplexes. But I think it also refers to income, right? And affordability. Would you care to comment on that a little bit?
I think that's exactly right. Missing middle has the advantage of allowing more households to share a fixed amount of land. So, for example, permitting duplexes where only a single family house would have been allowed previously allows two households to split that land cost. And then historically, in an era before zoning, we saw that what we would now call missing middle was oftentimes the bread and butter housing of working and middle income Americans because it has lower per square foot construction costs compared to a large multifamily building.
And any thoughts on the affordability context as far as who we serve or who would be in the missing middle, who we best can serve with that?
Well, I think it depends on the specific unit and the neighborhood, but anyone can be well served by missing middle who's looking for a neighborhood that has a fair amount of population density, perhaps retail and walkability relative to a very low density location. It can work very well for families because oftentimes missing middle units have direct access to the outside, which can be great for kids. Can work well for elderly people because missing middle units can be built to accommodate any accessibility needs while allowing people to age in the neighborhood where they've lived for a long time. And of course, single people who might want a smaller unit in than what the neighborhood would offer with exclusively detached single family houses.
So while we're waiting for Suzanne, it looks like it's just me and you having this conversation, and 60 some odd of our favorite friends that are in the space that we're talking about or stakeholders. So the regional housing partnership, one of the things that I particularly like about it is it brings what I refer to as the four pillars of a healthy housing system together. We have the governments, local governments part of it. We have the nonprofits that are in the space. And we also have the for-profits in the space, so the private sector, for lack of a better term. And one of the things we have the people who we serve at the table, plus UVA, which is a big part of this economy. So missing from each one of those little perspectives and your research, how can the local governments help with missing middle? How can the nonprofits help with the missing middle? And this is a big question. And how can the for-profits help in the missing middle? And pick whichever one that you're most comfortable with.
That's another great question. And my research is most squarely focused on the policy side, reforming regulations to make missing middle feasible. But to start with your second questions first, I think there's absolutely an important role for home builders in both the nonprofit and private sectors to adapt to building missing middle because in so many locations, missing middle has not been built in large numbers in recent years. There's been a huge focus on detached single family housing on the one end and large multifamily buildings on the other, that something in the middle may not fit with the current business models of lots of home builders. So there may be a need for new firms or existing firms to change their approach a little bit in order to make missing middle something that gets built on a large scale. But some nonprofit groups, Habitat for Humanity, to take just one example, have been really important players in pointing out the need to make this lower cost type of housing something that's feasible to build. Now, on the policy side, there's been a lot of focus on single family zoning, and rightly so, making that that largest typically zoning designation in terms of area something that can be more flexible. Allowing missing middle to get built is typically the first step in legalizing this smaller, lower cost type of housing. But the details are so important too. One thing that we've seen in some of the locations that have legalized missing middle housing is that not a lot of it has been built in the early years, in part because while duplexes or triplexes might be permitted on paper, there are still other regulations standing in their way, like setback requirements, parking requirements, or height limits that mean that adapting or redeveloping a single family house to accommodate more units might not make financial sense until the whole suite of regulations is addressed.
To play off of that a little bit, I'm personally involved in the Portland and Seattle's missing middle program as a consultant. And one of the things they found there, to speak to what you just mentioned, there's a component there that they did not think through in the beginning, which is the building inspection requirements, the building code requirements, that when you take a single family detached and divide it into multiple units, now you have to have 2-hour separations and all these different, which are all great stuff, great codes or great rules, but it also made it too expensive. From a history, so you researched for the whole country, if I remember our conversation correctly, right? So
Yes.
what examples have you have pulled out from different jurisdictions or different part of the country that you think we can import or use in our area? Is that a fair question?
Certainly, yeah. There are a few examples where something along the lines of missing middle, whether or not it fits someone's specific definition of what they take that term to mean. But there are a few examples of localities where small infill projects are getting built in large numbers. One that I'd like to highlight is Palisades Park, which is a small borough in Bergen County, New Jersey. And there are some northern New Jersey localities that never adopted single family zoning, Palisades Park being one of them. And this has meant that as land values and home values have risen a lot in recent decades, some of these localities have seen lots of redevelopment, taking advantage of these higher land values to allow two families to live on lots where previously only one family lived before. So while they never had single family zoning in Palisades Park, it was largely developed with single family housing. But there's been lots of infill duplex construction there. And it's a really interesting place to check out on Google Street Maps for fans of infill construction. I definitely recommend it.
I would suggest when you get an opportunity, look at Cape Charles at the tip of the Delmarva Peninsula. Very similar situation. They have a lot of single family detached that were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, or duplexes and quads. And I'm from Brooklyn. Anytime we talk about Jersey, I get a little bit like this, but just saying.
I'll definitely check it out. I'm not familiar with the infill construction there.
Well, it's a short drive from where you are. It would be very interesting to see from a historical perspective.
definitely. Another interesting example is Houston, which of course is famous for not having typical use zoning, although Houston does have lots of land use regulations that would typically be seen in a zoning ordinance. But in recent decades, they've reformed minimum lot sizes in Houston down to as low as 1,400 square feet. So that has made townhouse construction feasible in lots of places that were previously developed, either with single family houses or because Houston doesn't have use zoning in a lot of relatively low value commercial areas. So strip malls or light industrial uses have been redeveloped as townhouse communities in some cases following this minimum lot size reduction. And now again, whether these townhouses fit your definition of missing middle will depend person to person. But it's clearly an example of an infill housing construction model that's working very well for home builders and home buyers. Thousands, tens of thousands of these townhouse units have been built in recent years, many of them in very desirable neighborhoods in Houston that are close to job centers.
So some of the opponents or some of the folks that may not be in favor of missing middle, a term that I hear quite often is you are abolishing or you are removing single family detached zoning. That isn't necessarily so, is that correct?
Well, in some cases, legalizing missing middle will require changes to current single family zoning, but certainly it doesn't mean that single family housing has to change or can't get built. None of these proposals would stand in the way of single family development or redevelopment that I've seen.
So I'll change the question in a different way. If I own a lot in Charlottesville and I wish to build a single family detached home on it, I could do that. But I also, if this ordinance is adopted and so forth and so on, I have the option by right to build something else. Is that a fair way to explain it?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So have you found in some of your research in the different jurisdictions that there was a huge impact on single family detached? Hello, Suzanne. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Suzanne.
Okay.
Well, what I've seen is that reforms to permit missing middle housing result in very gradual changes over long periods of time. In Palisades Park, for example, there are now many of these duplexes that are allowed under their zoning, but it's taken decades for duplexes to become a major part of the housing stock there. It's been a very slow evolution. And that's always going to be the case when we're talking about changes to built out neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are only going to change as current homeowners decide that they want to move and sell or adapt their own house for whatever their own personal reasons may be. So it's going to be a much slower process of change and housing construction relative to what we see with greenfield development, for example, which of course can happen very quickly.
Suzanne, thank you for joining us. You're on mute, Suzanne.
This was quite a grand entry, wasn't it?
You know, I don't think I could think of any better. You know, I think at this point it must be over because it can't get any better than that.
My apologies, but technical difficulties and pilot error, all of those combined. So
operator
Keith.
error. No,
Sorry,
absolutely no worries. But the good news is I say probably the most difficult question for you. So welcome to the party. Look, we've been having a great discussion about missing middle and how it's working in different areas. But as it's been noted in the feed, there's as late as last night, there's been quite a few projects that have been rejected at the local government level that would have incorporated missing middle. So we're talking NIMBYism versus YIMBYism, right? So people not in my backyard and yes in my backyard. So from your perspective, what can we do to help change that narrative so that we, I think everybody's agreeing missing middle is a good thing to help the inventory shortage. So from your perspective, what does that conversation look like?
Well, thank you for giving me that softball question, Keith. I appreciate that. There are penalties imposed for being late to class.
Generally, it involves bringing alcohol to me, but anyway, that's a different story.
Well, let me begin. I'll answer your question because I do have an answer. But let me begin by something for the audience, because I think this is an important insight. A couple of months ago, a student came to me to ask about an internship. And I asked the question, which I always ask, where do you want to live? And she answered the question and quickly turned it on its head to me. And she said, where have you always wanted to live? And I said, I live there. And I've lived there for 31 years in the same house in Charlottesville. So I come to this with a love and admiration of our community, but with a desire really to push us a little bit. And here's where I want to answer your question. Part of the problem with NIMBYism is we are framing the question in the wrong way. In my view, we have framed it as housing. And so if you step back a minute and frame this question as the middle, and that is to say that we want a community that spans all demographic groups, all income groups, et cetera. Even to take it a step further, we want a community where the people who work in our community can live in our community at an affordable price. Then you begin to talk in a very different way about zoning, about design sensibilities, the sketchbook that Norfolk uses and others. You begin to talk about the community, and that's where I think we've lost our way a little bit. And here's really where I'm going with it. Housing has been, in my view, let me say first, we have the most innovative housing organizations anywhere in the country, thinking big thoughts, creative thoughts. So we have all the firepower here in this community to do what I'm about to suggest. And that is that the answer to your question is this intersection between neighborhood development, i.e. preserving neighborhoods for the people who live in them and keeping their homes safe and sound. Secondly, economic development. We have divorced economic development from housing and quality of life issues in too many instances. Doing a great job, but those are two conversations. In fact, quality of life drives economic development more than economic development drives quality of life. So housing is squarely in the middle of that. And then the third prong of this, how do we think about growth? And I'll just conclude with this. So the point is, as housing professionals who are listening, interested citizens, policymakers, et cetera, we've got to frame this conversation about the long-term vision of Charlottesville and include other people in that conversation, because what we've seen is economic development without an emphasis on quality of life issues. Take a look at the West Main Street project, which I can discuss later if you like. Every student who's ever had me has heard me. But beginning to think about—
We only have an hour, Susan. We only have an hour.
Okay, I'm wrapping up, I promise.
No, about
I
that
promise.
Main Street thing.
You don't have to call on me again.
Okay.
The issue is, how do we build our community? How do we provide quality of life assets to people in the middle who want to live in Charlottesville? And that is housing and many other things combined. I'll stop. Thank you.
No, you're doing great. Emily and I had a bunch of time together, so this is our time together to chat. So one of the conversations Emily and I were having was, my view, missing middle is a physical thing, and then an emotional, economic thing, right? Or on that end of it. So thank you for for quantifying that in much better terms than I could possibly do that. But let's take a little bit about what you were saying in a bit of a deeper dive, right? So unfortunately, I'm just looking at your two faces. I don't know who's on the call with us at the moment, or the Zoom or but let's assume we have a couple of folks that are on that call that are in environments where they're just getting bombarded by these not in my backyard things. What's some quick little bullet point takeaways somebody can have from this quick discussion we're having that arm them to have this conversation as you couched it? Does that make sense, that question?
Sure. I think the question to be revisited is for Charlottesville and every other community, how do we create through housing, economic development, jobs, schools, transportation, et cetera, the combination of that, a community that has a place for everyone. So just to give you a very quick example, we used to worry about, and we still want jobs in the city, but we can have people live in our city in the middle and work in other places. So how do we create a better sense of community using all these other tools at our disposal? That's kind of the issue. I did see Susan Steinmark's question. I'll get back to that if there's time.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you take it while we're doing it? I'm pretty much finished with my pre thought out questions. So let's dive into that a little bit.
Susan can speak for herself, but the question
I know that very well, by the way, personally.
The question is whether or not I can say with any certainty that economic development and quality of life are joined. Yes, I can, because I've done research all over the country. And so what we've learned is people say, well, have a strong economic development program and then you can build your quality of life. The fact of the matter is they're interchangeable variables. So in a city like Charlottesville that's talking about schools, transportation, et cetera, and the supports for people, we have to have a joint conversation. And I'll just say this, Susan, the community missed a real opportunity on West Main Street that we could, by not joining Feifel and 10th and Page, by doing exactly what we're talking about today and using properties to actually create middle housing in Charlottesville right along that corridor. So we bifurcated two neighborhoods by not thinking about this idea of quality of life and economic development together.
So how do we change that narrative, Suzanne? How do we change? So look, from my perspective, this is all a matter of education. You're an educator, right? This is what you do for a living. I come from the private sector, right? So I'm development, real estate, that end of it, right? And I look at us sometimes as being educators. So from your perspective, how can we educate? What's the steps? I mean, we're talking big picture stuff, but what's the meat and potatoes of it?
I think the easiest answer to that, Keith, or the quickest, absolutely. When I teach housing and community development, which I usually do every spring, our students want to know about what the houses look like, the design. And I say, we've got to talk about the financing first. So helping people understand that there are kind of three components to it. One is design, of course. One is location, but the other is who owns the land. And so as we in Charlottesville are thinking about middle income housing or middle housing, we need to look at who owns the land and how we can think about that in a very different way. For the city, for example, we need to be looking at every parcel that the city owns to think about how this might happen. Obviously in partnership with UVA and other partners, but look at what's done, it's been done by AHIP and Habitat for Humanity and PHA, these enormously creative ways of going about addressing this. So getting people to understand kind of the range of housing. And I think what has happened is that as we've talked about the density conversation, that has kind of fueled this NIMBYism without people understanding kind of the broader idea of what we want to accomplish as a larger community in Charlottesville. And I'll just conclude with this about the middle. In 1960, Pittsburgh had 50% of its residents considered to be middle income, 80 to 120% of the median. Now they have 25% or less. And I suspect if you looked at Charlottesville with a granular eye, you would see basically the same thing. And what I'm arguing is not only do we need housing, but we need police officers, teachers, nurses, grocery store clerks, et cetera, to have a sense of affordability in Charlottesville.
So Emily, why don't you jump in a little bit about what Suzanne is saying from your perspective? I know Suzanne's been talking a little bit more about the local perspective on that end of it, but some of these questions and some of these comments that we've been discussing from a more national perspective, how do you feel about that? What is your thoughts on that? And Suzanne, just you can just listen to this. There's one little nonprofit for affordable housing you missed, which I happen to chair, which is the Community Land Trust. Just saying. Got to add that to your speech next time. Go ahead, Emily.
Suzanne's comments were beautifully put on how missing middle makes our communities places that can accommodate households of more income levels and different types than a totally bifurcated housing marketplace can. Just to put some numbers on that, I mentioned the example of Houston townhouses earlier. It's not hard to find brand new construction, large Houston townhouses that are available at under $250,000 in one of the country's largest cities in neighborhoods that are not too far from downtown Houston. Now, of course, that's not a price point that's going to work for everyone, not the city's lowest income residents who are going to need other alternatives. But that means that new construction in Houston can serve households of teachers or firefighters or whomever are the households and families looking for housing at that middle income price point. And then over time, of course, these townhouses become affordable to lower income households. A more dated townhouse that was built a few decades ago is going to be more affordable still. So it's opening up neighborhoods and cities to this, to construction that is affordable to middle income households when it's brand new is a really important part of making sure that there are housing options for people all across the income spectrum.
So I'm going to fully plagiarize a gentleman by the name of Robert Liberties with Portland State University. I'm part of their cohort, national cohort for ADUs. What we're discussing right now is not a silver bullet, it's a silver buckshot. So there's many different little points of light, different silver buckshots to go ahead and fix this. We've got about 20 minutes left together. One of the comments in the feed, which I'd like to go back a little bit, is maybe more on my side of the house, on the private sector production side of the house. But let's talk about costs of this, right? Let's talk about why missing middle can actually produce more cost-effective of housing. Whichever one want to jump in on that would be great. Oh, maybe yes. Suzanne, you want to tackle that?
Sure. It's not going to be free. Let's say that. Sure. And one of the arguments has been, and I won't go into it because the people on this call know full well what I mean. We've had to make a lot of concessions in order to get private developers to build affordable housing, not only in this city, but every other city. So Clifford mentioned in the chat, how do we incentivize this? This could be a win-win, I believe, for the city. Just as Emily said, what it does is it makes our community more diverse. It gives our community a chance to reach new levels. So how can the city, the state housing agencies, the feds, public and private foundations, how can we begin to put together a package in an ideal sized city, a small American city, small to middle, that really looks at things in a very different way. And I'll make it quick here, Keith. One of the things that we've learned in planning over the years from urban renewal, it's not about tearing down, it's about building up and connecting. So how can we think about kind of restructuring from a design standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint? How can the city begin to have this as a priority? And the county, of course, but we're talking about the city today.
Well, we are and we aren't, Suzanne. We're a regional body, right? So our focus is on the 6 jurisdictions. And it literally, this was the next question I was going to go to. We've been talking about the city and maybe say in the urban ring, but how can missing middle impact or not impact some of the rural jurisdictions? You know, they have housing crises just as the city does. So in either one of your experience, maybe Emily, from a national perspective, have you seen this type of, I believe you've specialized a little bit in rural in some of your research, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, well, certainly missing middle can play an important part in rural housing solutions. For one reason, because in many rural communities, there's very limited variety in the types of housing that are currently available. Missing middle, when it takes the form of something like a garage apartment or a backyard cottage, can work beautifully in a rural community. If, for example, an aging homeowner needs to build a unit that might accommodate their accessibility needs, or they just want to downsize for whatever reason from their primary house, they might be able to move into an accessory dwelling unit and then have either a family member or a tenant move into their principal dwelling to use that as a revenue source to help fund their retirement, or just as a more flexible housing solution that can meet the individual needs of that rural homeowner. And many of our rural communities are experiencing declining population. So incorporating ways to make it possible for existing residents and new potential residents to live there in ways that meet their own needs is really important.
So to stay on the auxiliary dwelling unit conversation, Fluvanna County actually has an ADU ordinance on its books and has had it for quite some time. Happens to be my home county. But one of the, at least been my experience, and either one of you folks can chime in on it. It's been my experience that the owner occupancy requirement has been really impeding to the process, on top of cost and some other regulatory requirements. In some of the other jurisdictions around the country, those that have either remained that requirement in or removed it, any experience on, has that helped the missing middle? Has that helped affordable housing in those jurisdictions? And Suzanne or Emily, whichever one would want to chime in, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I know in the Northwest, ADUs have been very successful in helping homeowners stay in their homes. As Emily mentioned, elderly or other family members that would have access to housing. So yes. And a few years ago, my students and I did a study of the ADU regulations in Charlottesville, and we do have opportunities to do that, but not unlike your earlier question, Keith. Part of it is information, how people can, what the restrictions are in terms of size and place. But I want to build on one quick thing that Emily mentioned in terms of rural areas that we've been looking at a lot, and this is in urban areas as well, and that's abandoned schools and abandoned buildings to be retrofitted for housing. This is particularly important in rural communities where these buildings are more centrally located so that people have access to services, post office, doctors, etc., transportation of various kinds. So we are seeing a lot of that, frankly, in the Northeast where they're, and in rural areas where school consolidation has been both controversial and ever present.
So thank you for taking that on, Suzanne, because some of the, as I'm sure you're watching some of the questions in the feeds, in the chats, one of the questions was, what can we use this missing middle model in, say, some, Fashion Square Mall, for example, which is all for intents and purposes kind of abandoned at this particular point. So what does that look like? Is that a complete rezoning, or is, if there's a missing middle ordinance put together in the Albemarle County zoning code, is that becomes a by right? What does that look like from your guys' perspective on potentially helping this situation?
That's a fantastic question. And I've done some research on reforming current commercial areas to permit housing development. I've studied Tyson's in Fairfax County, which is very much not missing middle. It's been a focus there of permitting very large multifamily developments in area that was formerly primarily retail and office parks. But I think missing middle could also work very well in some areas that are currently zoned and developed for commercial uses, if the complete package of zoning regulations is flexible enough to allow for either adaptive reuse of current commercial buildings, or for something like development on a parking lot of a mall where the current amount of parking is no longer needed. There's been a lot of focus on opening up current single family neighborhoods to more flexible housing types, and very rightly so. But I think in some cases, the politics of allowing for new housing development in commercial areas might be easier, and might even present opportunities for building more missing middle housing faster than in areas that are developed for residential uses right now.
So why is that? Why do you think that the political atmosphere would be easier in the commercial environment? Why is that?
Well, in the Tyson's case, the chair of the task force who led the redevelopment planning effort there, I think put it beautifully to me. He said, Tyson's isn't anybody's backyard, or it wasn't prior to redevelopment. It's a community that abuts lots of residential neighborhoods, but at the time redevelopment planning went into place, it had a very low residential population, and it was just simply an area of Fairfax County where this type of large redevelopment could take place without upsetting many residents because of where it was located.
Suzanne, from your perspective, what do you think? Oh, I think we lost Suzanne.
Uh-oh.
I think we lost your picture, but I think we can hear you if you take it off mute, Suzanne. Okay, well, we'll let Suzanne reconnect and see if she can pick that up. I'm going to give a shout out to Douglas, reading the feed. Douglas, I'll connect with you. We're actually doing a really interesting program, and Emily, maybe you can comment on this with the ADUs out in Seattle and Portland, where they're working together with the land trusts out there, where the land trusts get to use, the land trust will actually lease the ground underneath the ADU. So the land trust builds, the land trust manages, and then the property owner receives the fiscal benefit of that. It's actually killed a couple of birds at one stone. It worked out actually really well so far anyway. I don't know that stuff. So Douglas, I'll reach out to you. Susanna, are you back with us?
Okay, I am. Okay, great. I can't see you,
Well,
but you can hear me
not much
okay?
to look at, so you're doing good.
Sorry for the technical difficulties here.
You're dropping a bunch of knowledge bombs, so keep on going.
Well, I think that what we're all coming around to are a couple of things. One is, I just from what I can read in the chats, nobody's against this. This is not, middle housing is something that every community needs. It's been on the national conversation, as you and Emily know, and many others, for the last 50 years as we begin to tear down to build up. So how we begin to think about that, and I think Emily's exactly right, having a plan of action to begin in places that we have a number of places, both in the city and around the counties, that could be retrofitted and we also have a School of Architecture where I'm sitting right now that it could help us think about that. So I think the issue is a commitment, a general commitment to building to two things. One is housing, but the second part of that is creating within the city and the surrounding counties, didn't mean to leave them out, an emphasis on quality of life and what people need in order to migrate to those cities. Rural areas are just slammed with young people wanting to leave to go to the big city or wherever, but now with more remote work, rural areas are certainly in the catbird seat if they have broadband. So I think our situation is almost perfect for thinking about what creative answers are here. And as I say, I think Charlottesville is the exact city to begin to lead those conversations. And many of you are, not to assume that many organizations across the listening area here of the PDC are thinking about those things, but bringing those together. Sorry.
No, Suzanne, you're doing great. An interesting stat just out of National Association of Realtors, I'm the statistics guy. Of all the millennial sales last year, 88% of them were in the suburban, purchases were in the suburban area. That's up from 85 the year before. And the year before that, I believe it was in the low 80s. I think Emily might be tracking some of this numbers. So there's this trend, particularly in the millennials, from moving from it's counterintuitive. Everybody thinks it's that way, but the numbers are actually showing the opposite direction. That's why this discussion about missing middle out in the rural jurisdictions, particularly we're very fortunate with Firefly and this broadband in the region that's becoming a new reality and narrative. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm trying to peruse some of the questions in the feed. So just give me a second and let me go through this. There you are. Welcome back, Suzanne. Again, we've got about 5 minutes or so left, and from my perspective, I keep on repeating this question. What's our elevator pitch, guys? What's our elevator pitch? I've got somebody in an elevator, and I've got 30 seconds to convince them that missing middle is a good thing for everybody. Unfortunately, there's more folks, it seems, that are against it than are for it. What am I saying in this elevator? So Emily or Suzanne, whichever wants to start first, that would be great.
I will answer it with a personal anecdote and turn it to Emily. Many years ago, the author of the book Bowling Alone and I happened to be in a symposium together. And he was talking about how people did not volunteer anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And I challenged him on it and said, you're not talking about the people who I know. The people who I know give to every contribution. They may work 6 days a week or more, but they are the absolute bedrock of communities through religious organizations, civic organizations, you name it, they are there. And so what we're talking about is building out of, and they were my parents, I might add. What we're talking about is bringing people into our community to give us, as I say, this diversity, this tapestry of people to build the kind of community that will include and provide high quality of life and economic opportunities and educational opportunities for all our children. That is what the middle can do for us.
It's an interesting approach on that. So when I sit down and talk to somebody about either buying or selling a house, it's very interesting. Very rarely it's about numbers. It's usually an emotional decision, right? Very rarely it's about how much we're going to make, how much we're not going to make. It's about, I want somebody to love my house as much as I did. I want to love somebody. So that love the house that I'm about ready to buy. So that's a great approach on that. Emily, you want to jump in on that? What's my elevator speech?
Yeah, I think Suzanne has the exact right approach. It's a focus on making room for today's children, adult children who are ready to move out of their parents' houses, and may not have a type of housing in the neighborhood or even region where they grew up that meets their needs that they can afford. So it's making sure that our communities can accommodate growth and can accommodate a wide variety of types of households and people at earning different income levels in a flexible form that allows communities to change as their residents' needs change.
So there's a great question that's dropped into the chat that I've been concocting in my head. So what examples do we have in the state of Virginia that Charlottesville, Albemarle, Havana, Nelson, Greene, and Louisa, our region can look at? I think once was Matt dropped in Norfolk, which is a great example. I also believe there's a couple up in Northern Virginia. You want to tackle that first, Emily? Some great examples and how we can use them here as to move this conversation forward.
Sure. Yeah. In Arlington, there's a big focus right now on reforming zoning to make more missing middle construction feasible. Arlington is currently a very stark example of the missing middle being missing. It has lots of apartment buildings along its metro corridors and some of its well-served bus corridors. And then it very quickly drops off into large lot, exclusively single family neighborhoods. And there have been a few successful examples of townhouse construction and duplex construction that are going to be potential models for having a wider variety of housing choices in Arlington. My neighborhood in DC, where I live, has an interesting example too. It's a historic row house neighborhood that's currently seeing a fair amount of multiplex construction. So it's going from one type of missing middle to another type that is allowing for it to accommodate more residents over time.
So it looks like Ian just popped in, which means we're running out of time here. That's my visual cue to Smith shut up and start wrapping this conversation up. I'm trying to follow the feed real quick, see if there's any couple of questions that we can chime in on. Ian, do you want to do the 5-minute wrap up, or would you like me to do that?
Go for it. I just want to hear, I want to see if Suzanne has any other examples from around the state. I'd be interested to hear, and then I can do my last spiel.
Thank you for reminding me. Thank you.
No, I would just add, but very quickly, Norfolk, I think they're doing some interesting things, particularly around design. So I would just leave it there for now, Ian. Thank you.
If you have not had the opportunity, whoever's watching it, to actually click on that link that Matt put in there, that design manual that they put together in Norfolk is interesting. And a little bit of Google search, and you can find it in different jurisdictions around the state. Well, I think we're at 5:50. We've got 56 minutes. We've got about a couple of minutes left here. Let me look at what I'm supposed to say, and then I'll just say what I want to say. Let's do that real quick. Well, look, Emily, thank you very much. Suzanne, thank you very much. You did that graceful late entrance and just became a rock star and just put a bunch of great knowledge out there. So thank you very much. Be careful. You might get a phone call and a coffee invite from me. So I might try to get a little bit more knowledge from you. Emily, keep up the good work. You're publishing a book on the subject, are you not? Did I remember that conversation right?
Not a book, but I have some recent research and ongoing research on these topics.
So how can people dig into that research? How can we get copies of that?
At the mercatus.org website has all of my research and short form writing there available. And I'm also active on Twitter at EBW Hamilton.
Thank you. So we're going to in about a week or so, this recording will be on our website, so folks can go back and look at it and review it. Any questions or comments or concerns, please reach out to Ian, how I can do better, how these presentations, or what I call lunch and learns, can do better. Other than the moderator needs to do a better job, we all know that. But if we can go ahead and do that, that would be great. Any comments on how we can improve is always a good thing. So I think our next one is on February 17th, and this is faith-based organizations in affordable housing. So please chime back in. That would be a lot of fun and a lot of discussion. And man, I'll tell you what, we've got well over 60, 70 people listening, watching us, and the questions are great. So thank you for participating. Thank you for supporting us. Thank you to UVA Credit Union. We couldn't do all this talking without you. So thank you very much for doing that. And I think I've milked this about as long as I could, Ian. What do you think? Anything you want to add in?
Yeah, I really do want to encourage folks to sign up for our last session, the faith-based organizations in affordable housing. It's going to be a really interesting discussion with some statewide and local organizations, faith-based organizations engaging in developing affordable housing here. So that'll be a really interesting roundtable. But other than that, please, I've included in the chat an evaluation survey. But we will wrap up because I know Suzanne has to teach a class. So I do appreciate everyone's time. And thanks.
Suzanne, I'm not joking. I'm going to chase you down because I'm actually on the UVA affordable housing team as a community engagement team. So I'd love to pick that brain of yours a little bit.
Well,
so.
I would love that. And I will tell the 70 students who got a 30-minute delay today because of you all that we need to get them engaged in as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
We're wrapping
Thank
up.
you.
We'll see you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily and Keith and Ian.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.